So I'm just going to briefly introduce Laurie in the second panel, but we've let's just make a link to the first panel. So interesting class, nation, race, borders, all these things are going to circulate again and again. In the 2000s, I got really interested in Bourdieu, how we could use Bourdieu to think about class, offer new insights. It was in that context I met Laurie 20 so years ago. Is it 20 years ago? I was
a bit less.
sorry, a bit less. Laurie just said Laurie works at ULB in Brussels, and she has this amazing dual, if I can put it in these, dual interest in quantitative methods and the aesthetic. So people don't normally use quantitative methods to analyze aesthetic issues, and so an amazing combination of skills, and it's in trying to think about how we use the sociological imagination to understand consumption and culture and class, which I thought would be great to host this panel, to chair this panel. So I'll pass on to Laurie. Next forward.
Thank you, Mike. I'm very, very happy to be here today. But I do have a confession to make. The initial title was Consumption, Culture and Class, but we won't be talking that much about consumption. There will be mentions of pizza. There will be mention of televisions, but yes, I think some of you might have expected us to talk a lot, or maybe a little, about Mike's collective book called Culture, Class, Distinction, published in 2009, with people like Alan Ward, Elizabeth Silva, Tony Bennett, Modesto Gayocal, and David Wright. And actually, for the anecdote, as Mike just said, it is thanks to this very research that I got to know Mike. As a cultural sociologist myself, we share an interest in, perhaps an obsession for me, with the role of cultural capital in inequality, and a slight addiction to statistical relational technique like multiple correspondence analysis. What's not to love about these beautiful clouds of points? And I'm looking at yours here. So we were, at least I was really into that. So the initial plan was to talk about culture, class, and distinction. But Mike, who, let's be honest, can't really stop working, went ahead and wrote another book, a recent book called The Return of Inequality. And the problem is that the book is very inspiring, and it inspires our speakers. So we're actually going to talk, I think, about that book as well. And the book reframes the role of cultural capital within a broader historical process of inequality production and reproduction. And it outlines, and here I quote, the increasing power of economic inequality to drive social division more broadly. So it emphasizes, in a way, the importance of volume of capital much more than the composition of capital. And to be fair, the world has changed. Over the last decade, we've seen major social, climatic, and technological shifts that forces us to revisit how class intersects with culture. So I was trying to get my head around all these issues. I was trying to think about the role of cultural capitals nowadays. And just because also I've returned from maternity leave, and it's only for 3-4 months in Belgium, I was still operating under baby brain. So I decided to get the help of someone you all know, and that is ChatGPT. So I asked ChatGPT what he thought of Mike's book, and especially Mike's view on cultural capital in that book. The answer was, not to worry, I did read the book, so just a bit. But I was just having like a playful experiment. And the thing is, and Mike will be happy about it, ChatGPT wrote, Mike is mostly right. So Mike, you are mostly right in your diagnosis of inequalities, complexity, and durability. However, he flagged some critiques, and I want to point two of them. So first, cultural capital might not be declining, and actually, according to it might not be declining, especially among younger generation, and it might even be more influential than ever in shaping class identity. And the second critique is that apparently the book runs a risk of overgeneralization, drawing together too many inequality sources, colonialism, capitalism, data elites that could flatten the specific dynamics at play. So obviously, ChatGPT read that somewhere on the internet. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. And in a way, we'll see what our panelists will have to say about all of that, or at least some of that. So the session really now is about exploring relationship between culture, politics, and class, alongside with other divisions like gender, race, and ethnicity. So we're actually going back to the issue of race. So our speakers, I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce the three of them now. First, we're going to start with Professor Annick Preiur. Annick Preiur from she's a professor in sociology and criminology from the University of Aalbourg, Denmark. I mean, Annick's work has significantly contributed to the understanding of cultural capital, class, and identity, and particularly in a comparative and intersectional context. I mean, together with Mike, she wrote a very important, very well-known paper, Emerging Forms of Cultural Capital, published in European Society in 2013. And in it, they argue for the emergence of a form of cosmopolitan cultural capital that reflects new modes of distinction in increasingly globalized and diverse societies. She's also behind, for those who know the network, she's also behind the SCUT network. And I think a few of you here have been involved in that network. So it was a network for the studies of cultural and social differentiation, which had a huge impact on the intellectual development of many of those who were involved. And also Mike and his then research center Cresc at Manchester was part of it. So Annick will talk about class analysis in an intersectional way. Our second speaker is Dr. Simone Variale. He's a tenure lecturer at Loughborough University. His work is really interesting in the way he combines cultural sociology, class analysis, post-colonial studies, and media studies. Is, I think, getting known, it's actually well known now for extending and critically interrogating Bourdieu theories of cultural capital, especially in intra-EU and post-colonial contexts. I can mention his 2019 papers on equal use migration in sociology, and also one of favorite of mine is 2021 paper in the SOC Rev, The Coloniality of Distinction, Class, Race, and Whiteness Among Post-Crisis Italian Migrants. And today we'll bring together class, culture, politics, and he will look at the political and economic implication of elite taste as well. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Faiza Shaheen. Dr. Faiza Shaheen is a distinguished policy fellow at the LSE, the International Inequality Institute. She was previously head of a global program on inequalities at the New York universities. She had 20 years of experience researching the trends and consequences of inequality, as well as designing policies and campaigns to address the causes of inequality and exclusion. She's been a left political candidate in her own seat in Northeast London. And I encourage you to have a look at her book called Know Your Place, How Society Set Us Up to Fail and What We Can Do About It. And Faiza will actually shortly join Tax Justice UK as the new executive director. And Faiza will talk about the relationship between class and politics through, as I understand, a portrayal of class on TV and popular narratives in the UK today. So thank you very much for listening to them.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Hello. I am very honored to be invited to this important event. I will present some reflections on how to handle the triangle of class, gender, sex, and ethnicity and race sociologically, and also about the language of inequalities. And across different traditions of class analysis, I do not think it is unfair to claim that they have had difficulties with integrating other differentiating principles. Class analyses have tended to overestimate the effects of class compared to other mechanisms, underestimate the complexities of how social differentiation is produced and reproduced through gendered and racialized or ethnicized mechanisms, and also to overlook insights from other traditions such as feminism and post-colonial studies. And we are united today to celebrate a great analyst of class with a very comprehensive work in the field. We have already heard about his historical works. I will focus on the sociological part, which is both theoretical and empirical, both quantitative and qualitative. And with a collective work from 2009, Class Culture Distinction, Mike's scholarship took a very clear turn towards a more Bourdieusian approach to class formations, which I, of course, appreciated, as it was through this common approach that we met. But now, Mike points out that Bourdieu's distinction was written at a time when economic inequality was at its lowest. Other forms of capital, like cultural capital, may therefore have been more important in this period than they are today. And I accept the point, even if it hurts a bit after having invested so much energy in studying cultural capital for more than 20 years. A part of the time then together with Mike. But of course, sociology cannot stay still. We have to move on and reorient our gaze, and respect to Mike for not just repeating the same analysis over his career. So this is also why I chose to use my time today on what Mike presents as more urgent issues. But I still think that Bourdieu's tools may serve us well, even if the world has changed. And I will focus on Mike's most recent book, then on inequality, which is also where he deals most explicitly with the issue of other dividing mechanisms. And when I chose the topic, I had thought I would be able to challenge him a bit, but when I reread the book, I found it difficult, as his argument was richer and much more sophisticated than I admit I had grasped at my first reading. But I will highlight some points and add a bit to them, attempting at a dialogue. In this book, Mike takes economic inequality as his point of departure, and he leans quite heavily on economic analysis. But he raises a profoundly sociological question of how to build an account of inequality that captures people's own sense of the relationship in which they live. And he's explicit on not reducing inequality to an issue of class, and he does not give a primacy to class by just adding the other dimensions to it, as many do. Examples would be how he highlights that the group of 1% wealthiest at the same time is nearly entirely composed of white men, and that the world of the super rich is deeply misogynistic. He also pays an explicit tribute to intersectionality as a perspective here, and there I quote, "As the circles of highly paid elites remain highly exclusive in gender, racialized, and class ways, so the feeling that however much you try, you will never succeed becomes endemic. Thus, feelings of structural inferiority, discrimination, and oppression are rampant, especially among those who are within touching distance of this elite world, can see its operations firsthand, and we experience their bodily exclusion from its inner core. The concept of intersectionality helps pin this down." And as many here will know, the perspective has its origins in feminism, ethnic, racial, and post-colonial studies, with the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who introduced the concept to account for how multiple aspects of identities influence each other, and how structures of power and domination work together and or against each other. Each combination of gender, race, ethnicity, place of residence, class, sexuality, ability, etc., thus provides unique life experiences. It has been a traveling and inspiring concept, particularly within gender studies, post-colonial studies, and studies of ethnic and racial relations, but enjoying less influence on the class analysis. And I wonder if this may be due to these studies being so established, so male and white dominated, and so quantitative. There is an evident problem that the categories have a difference in ontology, which is also recognized in intersectional scholarship. Class is not without bodily references, but not in the same way as the other categories. In principle, gender is a social part and sex a bodily, but gender retains a bodily reference. As to ethnicity, it should be the cultural part and race a bodily, but they are evidently linked, which is why I will treat them together in this presentation. Mike's sixth chapter in the book analyzes class, gender, and race ethnicity together in a historical perspective. And he here argues that economic inequality declined in the 20th century. Definitions of groups, as this decline happened, definitions of groups went from being categorical to probabilistic, which means that they were less defined by natural, moral, or ontological categories, and more in terms of life chances, advantages and disadvantages. It's a complex argument which deals simultaneously with the factual changes and with perceptions of them. While it may still be improbable, it is possible to move between classes. Class is not an absolute destiny anymore, and it is not perceived as such either. And the social sciences play a part here, as they have developed a language of probabilities and measures for it. This language reflects the realities, all while it impacts on the understanding of these realities. And when class moves, in some other sociological terms, from being pure ascription to at least partly a question of achievement, it may cause frustration for those who realize that they may have opportunities but not equal opportunities, or those who take the lack of success as a personal failure. In the early quotation on intersectionality, as well as elsewhere, my comments on the feelings of anger and resentment caused by a sense that mobility should be possible, but the experience that it is not within reach. And when class today appears more as achievement than as an ascribed status, it is because it connects so strongly to education, I think, even if it is widely known that chances in the education system are not equal. And this is why I guess we will never see quotas for classes or classes as part of diversity programs. But these programs are seriously threatened anyway these days. While it is not easy to move from one class to another, it is much more difficult to move between gendered and ethnic categories, and close to impossible to move between racial categories, which is also heavily disapproved of, but that's another story. Mike shows that also gender and race or ethnic origin have changed from being absolute destinies to representing probabilities, as they do not determine trajectories or occupations. Women, racial minorities, and working class people have been seen as possessing intrinsically different properties, but came to be seen as having systematically different life chances. In our scientific language, categories become variables, as Mike puts it. And I would like to add with another vocabulary that they become de-essentialized. Mike's next argument is that we are witnessing the return of the older patterns. He underscores and the record how the stuff of inequality is increasingly rendered as visceral, physical, and embodied, rather than abstracted into relative categories, and that bodily inequality becomes an intensified marker again. And this regards first and foremost the racial ethnic divides. Already in his book from 2000, Mike pointed to how increased immigration had caused a tendency towards racialization of work. In inequality, I find the information with reference to Khan that in UK, Black Africans and Bangladeshi households have only 10% of the average wealth of white British households. And Mike comments that this is not a gap, but a chasm. When the most bodily rooted identities become more determining again, it is also because race and ethnicity links to national citizenship. Mike highlights how they have become fundamental for differentiating between insiders and outsiders. And I'd like you to refer to the Norwegian criminologist Damse and Franco's paper with the telling title, "Without Papers, I Can't Do Anything: The Neglected Role of Citizen Status and Illegality in Intersectional Analysis." And I think we might add in class analysis. I would claim that there is nothing more determining for a person's trajectory than which citizenship they were given at birth, if any at all. To apply Mike's observation of the move from absolute to relative status and back again, this actually goes also for citizenships in Western nations, which over the past decades have become far less accessible for those who are not born in the country and have parents who are national citizens. I will quote several Norwegian sociologists, and here, sociology is very strong in Norway, isn't it, Jos? So, and Norway is the country where I grew up. And it is an affluent society with a strong social democratic welfare regime, with strong union traditions, and until recently, also ethnic homogeneity. Was that right, Peter? Over a few decades, Norway has become one of the European countries with the highest proportions of immigrants. It's gone extremely fast. And while the working class used to mainly be composed of Norwegian descendants in stable work situations, all unionized, it now has a large proportion of immigrants or descendants of immigrants, often in low-paid work on temporary contracts with limited rights. This is well illustrated in several chapters in the book I have highlighted here. If it wasn't so tragic in its consequences, it would almost be a bit funny to how the employers may justify job segregation by pointing to how unapt Norwegians are for hard work. They are too lazy. They are spoiled. They don't care about punctuality. And they declare themselves ill just with a dripping nose. So we can't use them. However, for more qualified labor, then Norwegianness, knowledge of language and culture, and personal aptitude, like humor, solid handshakes, and eye contact, exemplified here by John Rockstad, are necessary competences. Such communicative and social skills may be implicitly ethnicized. I am particularly worried as such evaluations may serve to justify inequalities, to hold that the poor deserve no better. And here is also a place where we see some kind of a more embodied capital is at work for creating distinctions. And when and this justification, we can also see it when like the justification of the low pay to au pairs, which may be justified by claiming that, oh, their salary that's a lot of money if they spend it in their home countries, which is justified. You may know this Danish series. If not, I recommend it. But therefore, thereby, the poor become undeserving and should not have a part of our cake, our welfare cake. As Mike writes, the cleavage between versions of nationalism and cosmopolitanism has become the central political fault line across much of the world. Both Mike and I have been engaged in showing how cosmopolitanism across both cultural tastes and political opinions is an elite project not shared by the popular classes. And at this point, I will rescue cultural capital again and defend it as an important tool for explanations. Actually, it provides a core explanation for the major political cleavages today, as they involve oppositions against the values and lifestyles associated with cultural capital. And I know that Simone will illustrate this point in a moment. We can also find it in Magne Fleming's recent paper in British Journal of Sociology on the Norwegian oppositions, on the oppositions in Norway between environmental attitudes, with also a telling title, Green versus Greed. And we now see a right wing that mobilizes on national, that now not only Norway, but more broadly, a right wing that mobilizes on nationalism and immigration issues, but also on gender and sexuality issues. Picking up again on Mike's observation of the moves from the absolute to the relative and back again, we actually see a striking revival of essentialist thinking. Ethnic origin is claimed to be an absolute destiny that cannot be changed, wherefore certain immigrants cannot be integrated. Gender is claimed to be the sex given at birth, and there are only two sexes. While only a limited minority of the populations are themselves concerned by LGBTQ+ rights, these rights have become a major political issue, which is actually a bit puzzling. Why do so many people care so deeply about these issues? I'll leave the question for now. Mike delivers a harsh critique of the misconceptions related to the period where we have witnessed reduced inequality and an alleged death of classes. Giddens wrote about life politics as if they related to choices, but they are etched deeply on the body. Fraser's oppositions between recognition and redistribution, and Inglehart's between materialist and post-materialist values, miss out on the deep intertwinement of economic inequality and identity, according to Mike. I agree. But which vocabularies should we then use?
Annick.
Yep. En passant, Mike coins an alternative politics, the politics of worth and value, which gives me a clue. This concerns what Bourdieu addresses with his concept symbolic capital. And here I quote from Bourdieu: one of the most unequal of all distributions, and probably in any case, the most cruel, is the distribution of symbolic capital. That is, of social importance and of reasons for living. He names it a hierarchy of worth and unworthiness, which cannot be directly superimposed on the hierarchy of wealth and powers, but he highlights how the black in the ghetto or the Arab or Turk in the working class suburbs of European cities bear the curse of negative symbolic capital. Lamont, here present, has also, all through her scholarship, worked with questions of social worth, respect, and recognition, and we will hopefully hear more about that tonight. Skeggs has pointed out how certain bodies become inscribed and marked with certain characteristics, some of which are read as good and bad, worthy or unworthy, and she employs the term attribution of value to personhood. Atkins and Tyler have also developed further on these questions. Mike refers to all these works, but there's something lacking in, as if the scholarships have not fused completely yet. And in a certain sense, value and worth is what all social divisions are about. A vocabulary, worth and value may serve to make visible and understandable the emotional underpinnings of today's cleavages and mobilization. I would here also like to mention Hochschild's argument from the deep south of US, which is that these people do not only feel the value, they are devalued, they are deplorable, as Clinton has so unfortunately put it, and they react emotionally to it, especially against those who tell them how they should feel about things, who claim moral superiority. And when I highlight emotions, it is because Mike mentions emotions all through his book. He writes about it because emotional states are effects of inequality, but they are also drivers for change and politics. He writes a lot about anger, resentment, frustration, anxieties, feelings of inferiority, and also a bit about positive emotions like the issues of respect, worth, dignity, and recognition. He's probably not thought about himself as a sociologist of emotions, but oh, but in a way he is. And I think would serve us to have a language of value and worth that can link the structural issues to people's emotional status. Others suggest to work on a merging of a class analysis, intersectional scholarship, and sociology of emotions. Combining the structural with people's lived experiences is a true contribution of sociology, and where sociology is more powerful than any other discipline. I have the same age as Mike, so I'm also in the last part of my career. I speak to the younger in the audience. Please continue in the footsteps of Mike, addressing the most urgent issues of our time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annick. May I ask Simone to take the floor? Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for inviting me. This is really an honor, and I'm pretty nervous actually. And also I have to live to the expectations of a quirky title. So today I'm going to talk about something very tentatively called a political economy of taste and the connections between sourdough pizzas, working class billionaires, and Mike's work will hopefully become obvious as I talk. So first of all, how I came across Mike's work, I did a PhD on new musical tastes in Italy. And so I came across Mike's and others' work about essentially a critique of the so-called omnivore taste, with essentially the idea that the new middle classes aren't really become more tolerant and open, but they engage in quite subtle forms of distinction, especially through an intellectualization of popular cultural consumption, a knowing mode of consumption of everything, and sometimes through practices that pretty much lead or sustain gentrification. Hence why the picture of craft beer. Just to briefly situate Mike's work in that context. I found quite interesting reading Mike's latest, sorry, wrong button. I found quite interesting to read Mike's latest book in a sense, coming from the work on new distinctions. And it's quite interesting because in a sense, my reading of your work here is that you are saying we should be careful in not overestimating the power of distinctions through consumption, something Annick also talked about. Because now essentially all social fields are largely dominated by inheritors. So you might like quirky popular culture, but it doesn't tell me much about the properties and assets you inherited from your family. That's really, I think, the key point here. There is a much more hidden political economy of inequalities that you don't get just focusing on social distinctions. So you have, in a sense, these mechanisms on the background of capital accumulation and cultural games of distinction that are kind of more superficial. That's how I read the book. I quite liked that part. It also made me think about the fact, as I mentioned to Mike earlier, that at the time I was listening to a kind of pop music, indie pop music, that was indeed made by inheritors, as it's obvious when you Google the people you listen to. So I think this part of Mike's work raises important questions about, in a sense, the future of the sociology of class and taste. As many here know, there is a long-standing tradition here of studying cultural taste and how it maps on class position. Through Bourdieu, through multiple correspondence analysis, I'm not trying to do a dismissive critique of this type of work. I learned a lot from it, but I think the point that Mike's make are quite important here. Because it is true that this tradition doesn't tell you something about how capital accumulation works, because it doesn't address economic inequalities. You might have indicators of class position that link to economic capital, but we are talking about capitalist processes, right? So this is not about individual taste or individual capitals. It's about the structures that distribute those resources. So has taste then become irrelevant to the politics of growing inequalities? Is this an exhausted late 20th century tradition, which I think at some Mike kind of suggests in his book. I think not necessarily. I think we might try to ask a different question. How does cultural taste contribute to political and economic processes of accumulation? And here again, I kind of take inspiration from Mike's ideas about returning to Marx, to Marxist problematics and concepts, without throwing Bourdieu away. I like Bourdieu. I want to keep Bourdieu. But I'm trying to show you how taste might actually shape accumulation, expropriation, and exploitation processes, typically, traditionally Marxist problematics. And in a sense, I also pay tribute to Mike's ethos here, the ethos of going beyond silos, of thinking across traditions and even disciplines. Okay, so this is really early ideas. It's not based on any project that I'm currently doing. It's really hopefully new projects. The connection between Farage and sourdough pizza, I'll try to explain later. Don't worry, I won't talk a lot about Farage. But you'll hear a bit more about Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. So first of all, where we can find elements of a political economy of taste, I think very much in far-right politics. So here, very briefly, you have the famous Farage beer passion being sort of broadcast through British media. You have Giorgia Meloni enjoying cherry tomatoes with all the nationalist undertones you can imagine. Viktor Orban apparently is obsessed about football. Again, the sort of things that comms offices sort of make sure people know about. And then this is from Germany. Actually, can't remember the name of this particular politician, but she's here tweeting about enjoying a doner kebab. Popular culture, basically. Now, this stuff might look quite innocent, perhaps. In political science, there is a lot of analysis of these symbols, and I'm kind of drawing on that literature. Interestingly, there isn't much about taste. It's more about nationalism, xenophobia, authoritarianism, but I think we can probably make a contribution here. These are essentially performances, public performances of broadly defined working class tastes and dispositions, because this is also about acting and behaving in a certain way that comes across as ordinary in a sense. But it's not really about class position. Of course, some have claimed a working class background. Giorgia Meloni actually did. Others would find it very difficult to do, Nigel Farage being a case in point. So I think first of all, we have to stop thinking that taste is always about class position. It can be a public performance. It can be a construction of an imagined audience, an idea of the people. And I just want to point out what these constructions, these performances do. First of all, they obscure multicultural working class realities. They use quite reassuring and emotionally resonant ordinary tastes to construct a constituency that is predominantly white and frequently, predominantly white and frequently largely male. So that is very much at odds with working class culture in Europe at the moment. And it's not just about large urban centers like London. In Italy, multicultural is everywhere. Okay, so it's not just in urban centers. So the working class, because the jobs that migrants and frequently their children end up doing are largely working class jobs. This is about obscuring then multicultural working class realities. More insidiously, perhaps, these public taste performances blur the economic boundaries between the working and the lower middle class. So you hear a lot about the red wall voter, for example, right? It's an easy image in the UK. You won't talk about differences between property owners and rentiers, for example, differences between landlords and rentiers, economic inequalities within the working class and between the petty bourgeoisie and the working class. These are important lines of stratification that we lose when cultural taste does this kind of community building sort of work. And then finally, these relatable performances open the door to policies and legislation that maintain or even increase economic inequality while exacerbating those inequalities within the working class. So that's what I broadly mean by political economy of taste in this context. To give you a more concrete example, I'm gonna look at Italy, especially the tension between Meloni's humble roots, as she calls them, and her social policies, because I think here we need to kind of go into a more holistic analysis. There is the performance, and then there are the policies that get legitimized through that performance. So Meloni is an interesting case because contrary to other far-right politicians, she can to some extent claim a working class identity, and she did. For example, here, right before the European elections, she said, I was mocked for years and years because of my humble roots. They called me a fishmonger, a greengrocer, a girl from the suburbs because they are cultured. Yes, you can see it in their deep reasoning skills, such culture. But what they never understood is that I've always been and will always be proud to be a person of the people, una persona del popolo. This is the closest you get to class language in Italy. It's very explicit. However, one of the first things the government did was to, in a sense, slash the so-called citizens' income, which was a minimum income provision introduced in 2019 that very much, in a sense, saved a lot of people from absolute poverty. So what the new government did, it made it more stringent, right? The income threshold to access it, makes it more difficult to assess. It has been estimated that the new provision essentially excludes about 50% of previous recipients, and there are a range of categories that basically privilege, let's say, an ideal of traditional family where there are care responsibilities, minors, maybe a disabled person, older people beyond their 60s. But essentially, the message here is everyone else from the working poor has to find a job, even if there is no job. We are the party, the government of hard work. So, and that excludes working age singles, recent migrants families, because you need to have 5 years or at least of continuous residence, and economically vulnerable women, particularly migrant women, single women, separated women. So we here basically have racialized, aged, and gendered economic inequalities within the working class that gets expanded through this new, more restrictive provision. And I kind of connect with Annick point about moving beyond, in a sense, a class versus race, class versus identity politics kind of framing, partly because this is the framing of the far right. The far right says these things cannot connect, but these things connect, in fact, in the way class inequalities are reproduced through these processes. So I think in a slightly more formal sense, here we can see how cultural taste legitimizes processes of political expropriation, which, drawing on Nancy Fraser, I'm kind of maybe simplistically defined as the use of state power to enhance capital accumulation through legislation, policy, and even violence. But basically here, taste really becomes a means of popular legitimation. You construct this sense of an inclusive, ordinary community, then in a sense, you attack the community that allegedly you were aiming to represent. And it's not just about the whiteness of it, because here cultural taste makes the whiteness more acceptable, because it becomes relatable. It becomes relatable through taste. And we know through Bourdieu that taste has that practical, embodied element that makes these symbols really, really powerful, right? I don't want to suggest a two kind of top-down and linear process. This is an open-ended and contextual process. Politics is still a field of struggle. So these developments have been challenged, continue to be challenged. But essentially, I just wanted to show how these taste performances are quite central to the so-called culture wars. And then, of course, culture wars have long-term economic and material implications. They are not just a symbolic or social media struggle. So that was my first example. Do I have time for the second example?
You have like 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick. So the second example is probably more straightforward in a sense. Here you have sourdough pizza from the city of Naples, Italy. I am from the city of Naples, hence my interest and long-standing ethnography, if you want. So pizza has been recently, sourdough pizza has been recently rebranded as a gourmet kind of thing. Again, the new distinctions. Here, that's the historic city center of Naples around the last 5 years, because with the city being rebranded as the place of authentic food and authentic culture, essentially there's been a massive growth of Airbnbs, apartments, tourism, particularly international tourism, and of course, evictions. That's what happens when property values go up. And social movements already exist on the ground that are challenging what they call over tourism or touristification. So I think this is a very, in a sense, maybe easier example of the political economy of taste. Of course, here, the Bourdieusian sociology has done a bit more work, because we have people who have worked on gentrification and how it is linked to omnivore tastes. But basically here I'm suggesting there's a much wider field. And coming from Southern Europe, foodification and touristification are massive. They are really central to capital restructuring and accumulation in places like Southern Europe. Of course, given that touristification and foodification tend to be active in places that are constructed as exotic in some way, I'm pretty sure if we scratch the surface, we will also find colonial legacies here. So the global South is potentially very, very exposed to these processes. So again, more direct engagement with the economic and political developments that we can have as sociologists of taste. Taste is still central to these processes. So given that I don't have a lot of time and I had a very clumsy slide that I really don't want to talk about, I'll try to develop it more for the potential publication. I just wanted to conclude basically saying I try to show how cultural distinctions through taste can shape political and economic struggles, how we can talk about a political economy of taste, and really show that taste is not simply a mirror of class position, but can be a means of capital accumulation, exploitation, and even exploitation processes, which actually I haven't talked about, but that's fine. And so I wanted to, I guess, conclude by tributing Mike's modus operandi and ethos beyond silos. I very much like when he talks about this in the last book. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, but please keep them for now, because we have to listen to, and it's a great pleasure to listen to Faiza Shaheen. Faiza, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't usually get nervous speaking anymore, because those of you that know me know I go on TV a lot and argue with right-wing politicians all the time. But listening to these sessions and these esteemed academics today, I suddenly started thinking on the break, like, how am I going to be useful in this discussion? I'm going to open myself up, actually. Mike's son had a good question to me during the break, which is that I was in the Labour Party until very recently, and know the Labour Party quite well and know why they're thinking about reform in the way that they're thinking about them. So I'm going to leave myself open to some questions on that. And just quickly to say a personal thanks to Mike. As some of you will know, I had a big public spat with the Labour Party exactly a year ago. And Mike really stood with me and stood up for me in an incredible way. And I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mike, and others in this room as well, who were very public in being on my side. I have got to know Mike over the last 10 years, but especially in the last 2 or 3 years, and some of what I'm going to talk about today, which I do take license to not stick to the title, is really about these kind of conversations that he and I have in our frustrations about the way in which class is spoken about, class is depicted in our politics, and the way in which our politicians are behaving. So I want to get into that. I came into, and I met Mike through when he did his work on the British class survey, which was incredibly popular. So I haven't been an academic. I've been mainly in sort of campaign spaces and in the think tank world. And more than 10 years ago now, when that work was launched, millions of people, and those not from the UK won't remember, or that are younger, about 7 million people logged on to this class calculator that was based on Mike's work from 2011, a survey that was run, a big survey that was run, Mike and others in this room. 7 million people engaged with that. We are obsessed with the topic of class in the UK, but I do really worry that a big gap has been left by sociologists and by thinkers on this space. It's really important to have this day, and I really want to focus on ways in which we can we tell the truth about class? It's such an important moment to do that, and perhaps ways in which you guys can help. I think 10 years on from that class survey, or more than 10 years now, of course, the situation has got much worse in terms of what it's like to be working class here and elsewhere. We held a day, a kind of closed door day with working class people, academics and activists in February, where we discussed different topics around class. And it was really quite depressing, to be honest, in some ways. I mean, one of the things that was really, really clear is that because we've had in this country more than 10 years of austerity, is those at the very bottom, their day-to-day lives now in this economic struggle is just so extreme. And that certainly comes out in housing, but it comes out in any relationship with the state in terms of benefits, for instance, or in the welfare state. And mental health came up so much that day in a way that I hadn't fully understood would come up. You know, it's really quite a worrying time. And this, of course, does leave people open to either just being completely despondent to the political system, which is fair enough, because that political system certainly hasn't delivered for them, and they don't see themselves in our politicians, or, you know, basically sticking their fingers up to the system, or moving to the far right and voting for the Reform Party. I'm not avoiding, I'm not saying that culture isn't important. I think actually the ways in which culture has been codified into that politics is through our TV diets, and the way in which we hear about class on a daily basis, and we see class on our TVs. And I think it's quite striking that the biggest export that the creative industry in this country now has is reality TV, often of working class people, to be laughed at. And I know people have addictions to reality TVs for all kinds of reasons, but I do think that I feel quite uncomfortable sometimes watching those shows, and those are what's beamed out about the UK. It's so popular. I lived in the US for a couple of years, and everyone wanted to talk to me about The Only Way is Essex, or Love Island, or Bridgerton, which is like another like weird you know, extreme example of sort of British society. And what's interesting about that is that they've put people of color in it as kind of equals in like royalty and the gentry class of that time in this country. And I think it kind of normalizes the elites and makes them look like a nicer, less racist bunch. But I want to really focus on, and I should say as well, this comes up loads in conversations with my husband, who's a working class actor, and he's Turkish. And he often gets these readouts of his parts. He'll get through like a script, and it will say something about what the part is. And it will often say, even though it will be inevitably a kind of quite working class role, so the kebab man or whatever, and it will always say, the readout will be something like pure evil. I mean, we've had that before, like Middle Eastern, pure evil. We did this experiment because I asked him to do it. This is white working class roles, they're often not played by working class people, of course, in those shows. And actually class was sometimes mentioned, and it was much more positive. So even in the way in which we're depicting working class life on our TVs is very much playing into racist stereotypes. My own work on race and class has been quite London-centric because I am a Londoner. Myself and an old colleague of mine who used to run the Runnymede Trust, which is the race focused think tank, Omar Khan, we did some work on race and class because we were getting very frustrated with the white working class narrative, because we started hearing in 2014, 2015, more and more before people would say working class, but they put white in front of it. The working class in this country are disproportionately people of color and immigrants. So of course it's very much divorced from reality. So we were like, okay, let's try and do some work on this cultural working class. Let's ask them what working class life is really like. And we started that work in London and then got some funding later on to extend that outside. And it actually was quite interesting, both the realities of working class lives across racial groups was very similar in how it was being felt, and actually across the country. And there was 4 things that came up in that, which we termed the 4 Ps as a way to remember it, really. Firstly and foremostly was the precariousness of working class life. And again, of course, housing was a big part of that, but a big part of that was 0-hour contracts, issues of short-term self-employment and work and low pay. Secondly was prejudice. And it was interesting to hear how white working class people also really felt that prejudice on a day-to-day basis, and in particular when they had any conversations or relationships, interaction with the state. Thirdly was power and feelings of lack of. And yes, that could come up in terms of not wanting to vote or engage with the political system, but more just generally not having any autonomy or say over their lives. And then fourthly, in terms of place, and that did come to issues of belonging. In London, that was especially about gentrification and being pushed out of place. It was everywhere. It was about pride of place, but in London in particular, it was that they would no longer have that place. Now, that work was done in 2019. And of course, that was in the backdrop of not just the Brexit vote that had happened in 2016, but also the big fire that was had at Grenfell Tower in West London. And some of the interviews were done in that part of London. And so, it was a very emotional, when you read through those transcripts, it was a very emotional sense of where the working class were in this country. And some of the things that struck me, we called that report "We Are Ghosts," because people just felt like completely invisible to the world. But also that Black and brown people themselves were saying, when we asked them, do you see yourself as working class? They said no. They said no, because they felt that to be working class, you had to be white. And that is the extent to which this narrative has set in. As I was saying, I've been involved in politics and started around that time doing quite a lot of kind of door knocking and thinking about political narrative and canvassing. And the work that followed afterwards was much more about how race and class was coming up in political language, how were our communities being spoken about. And we set out to do some work looking at how essentially looking and at the language that was being used in the media and by political elites. And we found very, very clear statements of the world today. And I want to read what we found in terms of the story that was told from the right and just the importance of class in that. Imagine I'm Nigel Farage. No, don't. Britain was once a great empire. She did great things for the world, like abolishing slavery, pioneering the Industrial Revolution, the workshop of the world, and defeated Nazi Germany. There was a real community spirit, the kind of place where you knew your neighbors. The working class provided for their families, their wives and children. We had pride. then people started coming here from all over the world to use all the things that hardworking British people built, like welfare, the NHS, council housing, and jobs. They spoke differently, they dressed differently, they ate different food. The establishment helped them access education, employment, and a home to where they are to make sure that they were okay. But then they just never stopped coming. Britain joined the EU, the establishment said it would be good, but the hordes of Eastern Europeans came after British people's jobs, driving down wages. Now illegal swarms are at our shores for benefits. That's not even enough to, there's not even enough to go round. And the white working class can't get a job, can't get a roof over their head, can't get a doctor's appointment. And they give them all to foreigners first. The white working class are being left behind because the woke brigade was busy being inclusive, giving opportunities to minorities and females. They forgot to include the white working class. White working class boys do worse at school. The liberal metropolitan elites don't care because they don't tick any boxes. It's not fashionable or politically correct to talk about them. Now, those of you in this country will have heard elements of this, certainly, and probably abroad as well, because this language is being shared in a playbook. And when I did work at New York University, working with governments around the world, where there were either centre-left or left governments in power, it became very clear that there is that conversation happening. And this story, which has not just the white working class element, but also the elites and talks about the establishment, has a very clear class narrative. It's not the one that I'm sure all of us in this room would want to tell, but it's very, very clear. And when we looked, and we took our time to look, when we looked for what the story is from the left, or what the counter story to this is in terms of class, we couldn't find one. We didn't find one. And that work, this work was done in 2021, 2022. You know, I remember our researcher saying, I've been trying to like piece something together and it's barely there. And we hear, of course, from our politicians now about, you know, the Labour Party talks about working people, and they're nervous about talking about class, and working people is almost, and Mike wrote a really great blog about this recently, is a way to sort of distinguish between deserving and undeserving, right? It plays into the idea that these people are working and therefore they deserve something, and the people that aren't working do not. So, I mean, and it was, as I was listening this morning to the kind of historical backgrounds and history of sociology and where we've got things wrong, I just really felt that that statement really brings it out, right? That they've really plucked on the areas that we've missed and brought it together in a form that is appealing, and gives people pride, and gives them in this sense of feeling that the world is very difficult for them, gives them a sense of feeling part of something. And so I wondered, you know, sometimes people think in academia that it's far away from the action, but I just this morning just really felt, you know, the power of this discipline, sociology, with that boundary with historians as well, I mean, or lack of boundary. I think, you know, this is a sign to us that we need to be much stronger in telling that counter story and bringing it together. And as a provocation, I guess, to you, you know, I'm just about to go back to the campaigning world, and a lot about tax is talking about the elites and class now, but still not enough. And so how do we start telling the truth about class, and what's the work that needs to be done? As someone that's worked in politics and campaigning, I would say, firstly, we do need to be thinking very, very carefully and much more about narratives and language and the story that appeals to people. Secondly, that we need to tell a very different story about community. I grew up in a working class community, and you know, those people still look after each other's kids and pick their kids up from nursery if they can't make it, and there is still those connections, but it's a story that's never told. I must ask, we talk about race and ethnicity, but so much now is about Islamophobia. It's religion as well, and the story they tell about what they call the Islamification And it's even the threat of that, even where there aren't Muslims, we're used as a threat. And it's Eid, by the way, so Eid Mubarak. I think I would ask as well to please do get your hands dirty and talk to politicians and try and push this work that way. And I thought it was interesting thinking about, who influenced Blair. And it was, there were key sociologists that he did look to, and economists. So, let's think about how we push our work and influence politicians that way as well. Yes, so I'll leave it there, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you. That was actually very fascinating. I thought it was fascinating. And there were quite actually a few common grounds and common threats. So I'm going to give the floor to you guys. Do you have any questions for our speakers? Yes? You need to keep it pushed down.
I'll just project as well. So, that's just excellent panel of amazing speakers, and to pick up on Lars' point about sociologists influencing politicians, if anyone missed it, Ofsted, the education regulator in the UK, started using cultural capital as a criteria in the regulation of early years education. I wonder what the panel thinks about how can we guard against sociology's concepts losing their critical edge in the same way that meritocracy did by Young, and then what could be the counter story of recent studies?
You want to take a few? Yeah, sure. I'll take a few so that I'll give you some time to think about the answers. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel as a whole. But I guess I want to pick up on something that Preiur said at the end about this need to find a counter story from the left, and the sense of disappointment that there hasn't been one. I mean, to the extent that the left might include us as sociologists and historians in the room, then I think partly we're complicit in that inability to create a different story, because we've been part of creating the very story of the white working class and the left behind to start off with. So the work of Young and others in the New East End precisely presented sort of in a positive or a sympathetic mode, at least, the concerns of what they understood as British citizens, who were white citizens, at being left behind and not being able to access all the things that you were talking about that they were accessing because of the newcomers who were coming and taking it all. And linking that to tax, one of the things that I think is interesting but very rarely addressed is the fact that colonial subjects paid taxation to the Westminster government for at least 50 years, if not more, than the white British working class and middle class did. So the working class and middle class in Britain only started paying income tax during the First World War. Indian subjects were paying taxation to Britain since the 1860s. And so if anybody's paid into constructing the welfare state, it's those of us who come from the colonial connections to Britain, not those who claim a working class heritage in Britain. And I think that this goes back to something that Mike said at the end of the last session, that Britain's never been a nation but an empire. But very little of our sociological or historical work takes that insight seriously to actually then think about what does class look like if we start from the empire and not the nation. So, in a sense, I guess it's a provocation back to you, Mike. If you were to rewrite the book on class formation in the 20th century, where for most of that 20th century, Britain is an empire and not a nation, how might taking empire seriously change the arguments that got made in that about what class is, and how might that be the basis from which we develop a class politics in the present that isn't parochial and identity based, but is actually about the structural exclusions that limit so many people's lives.
I'll take a third one. Yes.
Hi, yes, thank you for 3 really interesting papers. So, kind of on your point about kind of we as sociologists, what is our role? Are we leading? Are we taking ownership? Are we helping shift conversations? As an American, but having been here 14 years, one of the things that's really kind of always bothered me was this conflation of migration status, of being immigrant with being a person of color. And Faiza, you made it a point of making the distinction that I do, which is, migration status. Well, there's often, there can be overlap with being a person of color. Many of us, I'm from America, but many of us people of color go back multiple generations. And so obviously in the first two papers, and I understand kind of the reasons why and kind of the way stats are collected, particularly in the continent, but I think that when we accept the language of conflation of migration status and, migration background. So again, often, I'm a Francophile, so like France, when people go back 3-4 generations, but it continued to be referred to in the migration status lens, what folks are really seem to be saying, and again, this is my impression as an American, we talk about race in more upfront ways, but it always seemed to me as a proxy for when race is really what folks mean. But I think it's really important to not, because, with the fights that we've had here, kind of, and the framing of Brexit, which again, very dog whistly in terms of being about race. I mean, obviously migrants from a lot of backgrounds, but certainly the imagery that we got, of course, we know was very racialized. But I think as sociologists, I think, leading the way by, I've been here 14 years, but still, learned colleagues, using, kind of accepting the use of this term, migrant background. I think it really continues to other folks who have been, 3, 4, or 2 generations in, when it's, so I think we have to move past and kind of push beyond, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the stats aren't collected that way, particularly in the continent, in terms of, people's, migration status. Really, we're talking about race, and I think we need to be more upfront and honest and kind of probe ourselves deeper and challenge ourselves to be leaders in reframing things, so that we're not furthering the othering, kind of ceding that language space to, far right and others who kind of similarly, kind of have find problematic, are both xenophobic and racist. So.
Thank you very much. Would you like to comment on some of the comments?
Yeah. Perhaps you should.
Yeah.
That's most you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think the point about, the histories and painting, I have spent many years knocking on doors and political canvassing, and it doesn't come up very often because people don't want to say things to your face. But there was a couple of conversations I've had over the years where I have said about when they've spoken about immigration and more generally, that I have said, actually, you and our histories are very much connected. It's like historically, my family in what was India, paid taxes here, and your family, if you're from a working class background, you also were servant to the elites here in a way that sort of my community was. And it's quite interesting how people kind of can get that story. And I think one of the things that in a lot of my work, which has been very public facing, is that people can get it. They do understand, but you have to tell them. And so, I think that there is hope in there. And I think, how you construct that story and understand that actually by telling that story, there is a strength in this country by being honest. And there can be pride that's found in that honesty and who we are now and who we can be. One thing I would say is that, I didn't get to talk about the sort of material conditions as much as I would like to, but the things what connects people. In that story, we need to talk much more about what connects people in our fights. So rather than, the reason that you can't get housing is because of immigration, the reason that you can't get housing is because of the way in which private property developers behave, the way in which the global elite are hiding their money and money laundering in this country, And again, there is actually a lot of anger out there at elites. Even if you look at reform voters, some of the most popular policies amongst them are higher taxes on the rich. Now, Nigel Farage doesn't obviously say those things and buy into it, but when they're polled and asked on these opinions, there is a very strong feeling amongst that group as well as many others. So I think it is about a kind of historical story, but I just would say that it's really important that in whatever story we try and not to force it, but there is to build a story of connection and solidarity and ways through together, without kind of, again, like pitting groups against each other, like we've been paying in more longer than you or whatever, you know, just finding a way to say that we've been paying in too, and we've been giving, you know, actually using a Bridgeton example again, I was watching it with a very good friend of mine whose dad used to work in the docks in East London, and we were saying we would, both our families would historically be serving these people, whether here or in India, in the kitchen, and you know, there is that story to be told, and I think people can get that. I think the migrant background, yeah, I think it's sort of done it on purpose because it's an idea of like belonging and not being part, right? And I think it is really important to, again, like how you do that whilst building a sense of like commonality, because what you don't want to do is be like, well, I've been here for 2 generations, therefore I should get more than these migrants or these. I mean, we do get that. I mean, unfortunately, you get a lot of very public minority ethnic politicians that are extremely cruel about new immigrants, and so yeah, I think again, it's like how we build that story without creating more division.
Can I try jump in? Because I think the question's very much connected on, and also what you said, Preiur, about what I think is the challenge of writing structural stories, but that are also relatable on a personal level, in a context in which we have the far right that basically use identity as a weapon. So these identities that become very hard rock, and then you get to the hierarchies of oppressions. I'm here, I was here longer than you, hence blah, blah, blah. What Gurminder also said. So how do we convey these complex structural post-imperial histories, but in a way that people connect to? Because political economy is in itself, it's a boring and technical subject. You need to make it relatable in some point. So I guess the point is how we have to place people in these broader reconstructions. But we do need the broader reconstructions, because otherwise it's all about identity. The white working class, even some migrant communities who may argue I was here before Brexit, from the 60s. It's a moving target. You don't go anywhere in progressive terms, I think, if you go with identity, and that's it. It's the identity without context, in a sense. That makes any sense.
Well, I find it a bit difficult to answer these questions because I'm not British and I have never lived here, but I remember a story that would perhaps answer a bit to what you asked for, and that was when your foreign minister Robin Cook some 20 years ago declared that now chicken tikka masala is should be the national plate of the UK, and and actually it was a discourse about integration and in the field of food, which is really perhaps the right place to make it, and then I wonder what happened to that discourse. Is it dead?
Well, it was just it's really hard not to get angry. It was a story told that was very superficial. That was, at the same time that we'll eat your food and we like you coming here because you've given us spices, we will at the same time make your life very difficult and make it hard for your kids to do well. So that, it does also come back to the economic, you can talk about these things again, but almost, and Osborne said it, right? George Osborne, who pushed austerity, which her, and this is the research that Runnymede did, that her working class women of color the most, he was like, but I love a vindaloo. I mean, it's a very shallow way in which to use the cultural capital side of things. Yeah,
I think we still have time for a couple more questions. I've seen Talia and perhaps John afterwards. Oh yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to give the floor to the lady because she hasn't talked afterwards. But first Talia and then the lady.
And now I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't because I get another chance. So, but I wanted to pick up on something that you just said about the food, and that goes back to the example where you didn't know who the German politician was that made that picture. It was a very particular story to this. It's a right-wing politician that was caught in Brussels by another person eating a doner kebab. And that picture was posted. So I think, when I'm not completely wrong, and I'm not an historian, so sometimes I'm not so good at that, but I think that picture was made by her to make a claim about inflation. It was exactly what you just said.
I eat doner kebab, so it's fine. If that's not right. Yeah.
That could just kebab, as long as they don't bring the sharia, right? So it was very much an anti-Muslim, and I think that's the other point. And I want to sort of go back to that question of, what is the race? Should we talk more about race rather than by migration background? Because I see the point of the sort of not making categories of who got here first, but there's something else about it, and that's when in Germany people talk about migration backgrounds, they mean race. I'm a migrant. My family's lived in Germany for 15 years. My kids are white. My daughter has a boyfriend who is very German, but his family background is in Turkey. When they go out, he's the migrant. She doesn't even think of herself as German, but she will never be. And every time you get into these discussions, it's very clear. When on the continent in Germany, when people talk about migration background, they don't mean migration. It's about race and about Islamophobia.
I'm sorry, I now feel like I stole your, but just in the name of diversity being younger. Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about racial relations or whatever, and these inequalities in London and in Britain, how they play out for a while now. I'm also an immigrant. I'm Eastern European, by the way. That's also one of the things. Like we also speak about Italians, and Eastern Europeans were actually the reason of Brexit. Not well, at least that's how it turned out. So I don't want to be like the defender of the white people, but I think just bringing together everything that was presented in this wonderful panel, there is a fraction of middle class in Britain that does rely on cosmopolitanism, and good relations with the right immigrants and the right people of color as a way of cultural capital. I think there are studies I was reading for my dissertation about that, and about the despise of white working British class and everything that's goes with the word chav. So there is work to do with legitimizing the being white working class person, possibly on benefits and things like that. So that's just one thing. And I also I think we sometimes lose sight of the successes of living together. I think someone on the first panel, that father of a girl, mentioned studies of conviviality or something that I'm gonna be Googling when I come back home. I think we lose sight of successes of many communities in London, one of which is mine, living being benevolent to each other and being real communities and having strong and weak ties across race lines, across migration background lines, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think sometimes by trying to say that they still have these divisions, we might be better off also telling their success stories. So that's just, thank you.
Maybe John.
I'll try and be quick. Two historical things, I'm speaking for history. One was just thinking what you were saying about the populist right candidates appropriating taste, and thinking if you look historically, the left was very comfortable doing that. And so it's interesting that Harold Wilson in Britain would be a famous example, who was not in any sense working class, but was very comfortable having modest plebeian taste. So not performing the fear that you will see inauthentic. something else is going on, and I did think that we need to sort of push back a little and think, well, why is there this crisis of performative politics for figures on the left, in a sense? And that links to the other historical thing in your talk about, you know, there's no other story, Faisal, because there used to be, if you look historically, there was a very powerful story of the left about class, and it was a bit crude, it was class trumping race, but initially the trade unions and the left in Britain undoubtedly, in a pseudo way, were backing white rights, but very quickly moved to making an argument about they, the employers, we would now say the elites, are trying to divide us, we're united. And so the defeat of class politics by Thatcher and her successors, the defeat of that tradition, so that now politics of class is available more easily to Farage than it is to Starmer, who's born working class, is incredible. And understanding that history and giving you some sense of what did work in the 70s and 80s, how do you reconstruct that politics of class unity that isn't now trying to say classes, we're all working class, and it trumps it, but brings out that sense of heterogeneity as part of what it is to be working class, is obviously the answer. And thinking that it did once work maybe helps believe it could work again.
Maybe if you want to give some final words, please have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I think there is a kind of contradiction, because on the one hand, it's like the white working class are elevated amongst these, you know, purely cynically by this far right in order to get them on side. They have at the same time been thoroughly demonized over the last decade as and I'm saying these things with historians apart, but here, but I mean, yeah, the whole chavs that, you know, Owen wrote about that, the chavs thing, you know, like what I was saying about a lot of these reality TV shows, it's just like it just makes them look stupid. Like it's really like not a nice way to depict people often. I think there is that, but you know, again, it's like, how do you then build that sense of unity that they actually, you know, want us to dislike each other? They're making fun of all of us, right? They're using us. And how do you build that? And I think, yeah, definitely when the trade unions were strong, I mean, part of the problem is that, of course, the decline in collective bargaining and trade union membership, but certainly there was a story that was once told, and what can we learn from that? How can we build from that? And, you know, recognize these histories, because empire is being used, as I read out in that statement, in this very negative light or untruthful light. So how do we bring that together? So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I'd love to see that paper on like what did work and what we might borrow from it now. And I know that there are, whilst yeah, the current leadership of the Labour Party sort of struggles, I know that there are people that want to be able to talk about this. They don't know how to talk about it. And so they either play into some of the Nigel Farage stuff, or they just say nothing at all, which is almost as bad. Like, I mean, I used to run a think tank that was funded by the trade unions, and the Brexit vote happened at that time. And the union reps they were doing a Remain campaign, Unite, which at that time was the biggest union or the second biggest. And they had said to their union reps on the ground in various different workplaces in the country, like, you know, make an argument for Remain. And all they were hearing back is that everyone wants to talk about immigration. And they were told, change the subject, because Unite didn't know how to respond to that. And again, it's that absence of story that is really making it difficult.
Well, I think we're going to close the session. I want to thank our speakers. That was a very interesting session, and thank you to all of you for listening to it. Thank you.